Repton in London. It's not going to be the film of the book today, but I do need to give a little introduction about what London was like in Repton's day. Repton realised that the centre of power was in London. So in 1786-87, he moved from Norfolk to Hare Street, which is near Romford, about 15 miles from central London. Romford was on the main coaching road into London, so he had no problem getting into the city and the West End, where many of his clients would have had at least a townhouse, if not their country estate. The book, Repton in London, has 15 authors, and we discuss about 17 or 18 sites out of the 57 or now 58 sites identified as being in London. Now, the map, based on a late 19th century map before Greater London had been thought of or increased in size, shows, I think, 57 red dots spread around. The northeast, of course, is Essex, the southeast Kent, southwest Surrey, and the north and northwest, either Middlesex or Hertfordshire. Middlesex disappeared entirely in 1965. Now, Repton in London, as I say, has 15 authors, and including the sites that we looked at, there's two of his major sites, two of his most prestigious sites, which are Kenwood in Hampstead and Wanstead in northeast London, now formerly part of Essex, and also a group of interesting villas in the southeast, formerly in Kent, including Sundridge Park, which is now a golf course with a mansion by John Nash, or working possibly with one of Repton's sons, which is a golf club and now turned into rather posh flats. And another site, where his influence was perhaps less benign, was the site he did at Holwood for William Pitt the Younger, where he levelled a great deal of the Iron Age fort, known as Caesar's Camp. He levelled the ramparts to improve the view. It didn't improve the earthworks. Now I'm starting with Kenwood. This is an engraving which he admits is partly from memory, from Loudon's Villa Gardner, but it does show some of the work that Repton recommended at Kenwood, although he didn't oversee the work there. He recommended moving the main road, which runs along the north, to take it further away from the house, to give a better approach to the house. He extended the terrace. He recommended the construction of the flower garden to the west of the house. And he also recommended adding wings to the Adam mansion to give more accommodation. And interestingly, the wings, when built, had plate glass windows. They didn't have glazing bars to bring the landscape into the view. A rather picturesque view of the house in the late 18th century before Repton had set to work. A very curious hybrid animal in the foreground, which seems to be a cross between a fox and a kangaroo. A rather more polite view showing the Adam portico. And the drive, the picturesque approach to the house that Repton recommended, following a serpentine line down through the ancient oak woodland to the front of the house. And the view of the house from the south, looking across the lake back to the Adam south facade. I'll be talking about various recurring themes. One of the recurring themes is tunnels of planting. I'll show you some other examples. And this is the Ivy Tunnel. Whether it dates back as long as Repton, I'm not sure, but it certainly was there in Loudon's time. And it shows one of the early members of the London Parks and Gardens Trust sketching club looking at the view. One of the sites, in fact, the site I'm going to be talking most about is Regent's Park, which you'll say was not Repton at all. Regent's Park, formerly known as Marylebone Fields, Marylebone Farm, was on land that had been acquired by the Crown in the 16th century from the church by Henry VIII as a hunting park. And by the 18th century, it was leased to the Duke of Portland, who let it out for farming. But it did have the advantage of public access. And when later, from about 1811 onwards, Nash came up with this scheme for redeveloping it for the Crown estate. Public access was substantially lost, and that had repercussions later. Now, the scheme that Nash drew up, you'll see on this map of Plan and Marylebone in the early, about 1830, characteristic shape of hunting parks, of course, is they're largely circular, and even now that persists. The Nash's layout was incorporated a canal around the north and east sides, which is interesting in itself, very characteristic of the early 19th century, to combine sort of beauty with utility and trade. And there were barracks, and there was a market. And then there was also a string of very grand, rather theatrical terraces around the perimeter of the park, plus a number of villas set within their private landscapes within the park itself. Originally, there were to be something like, I think it was 56 villas. The number was cut down to 40-something, and eventually only 8 were built, and not all of those survive. A couple were lost during the Second World War. I'll read you a bit about what people have had to say about Regent's Park. By 1811, Nash and Repton were no longer in partnership. They'd fallen out in about the year 1800. But Repton's youngest son, George Stanley, joined Nash's office in 1802 and stayed with him as one of his principal assistants for quite a long time. As Dorothy Stroud says, George Stanley was an excellent draftsman. Through George, the Repton influence continued to make itself felt in many of Nash's later works. Blaise Hamlet, St James's Park, and most of all at Regent's Park. The whole conception is as Reptonian as could be. Anne Saunders, in her book on Regent's Park, says, where Repton had perfected the landscape around a single country house, Nash landscaped a whole small town, and in doing so created a new architectural and social ideal. And I think that can be argued that it was set the precedent for a lot of public parks, and indeed for garden suburbs later. And Edward Hyams wrote, there can be absolutely no question that it was Repton's influence that made Nash submit such a plan. So it is quite as much to Repton as it is to Nash that London owes Regent's Park. Another view of the lake. There's a couple of rather wonderful early 19th century panoramas. A coloured one by Richard Morris, published in about 1830, and a sepia-toned one by John Mortimer, about 1828, 1829. This is the view now, looking across the lake towards Sussex Terrace. A rather picturesque view showing a minaret of the London Mosque. Now, no country estate could exist without a lodge, and there are a series of lodge houses and lodge gates around the estate. This is the lodge at Hanover Gate, in a 19th century engraving and a modern photograph. And one of the original lodges was Hanover Lodge, which has had a going over recently, I think, and the home, which was built by Decimus Burton for his father, James Burton, who was one of the principal builders of Regency London. That's as it was at that time. That's as it looks now. And of course, no major estate could fail to have a church or two. So this is the very urban Marylebone Church. The rather smaller, almost colonial looking. It could have escaped from, I don't know, the West Indies or perhaps the eastern states of America, St John's Wood Church. And then a series of pictures of one of the terraces, Gloucester Terrace, large theatrical building with the terraces have their sort of private land in front of them, now maintained by the Crown Estate Commissioners. And then there's a transition from that to the public domain. View out into the park, and a view of the terrace from the park. Very characteristically, the terraces are designed with the so-called palace front. That's to say you have a classical composition of a centrepiece, end pavilions, and then any number of buildings, relatively anonymous terraced houses kind of joining up the bits in a rather child's building block sort of way. View from the terrace into the park. One of the issues at Regent's Park is how high the hedges should be around the park. They're mostly higher than they should be to hide the traffic, but it does interrupt the continuity. The part of the concept, of course, was that in your private terraced house, you should look over the park as though it were an extension of your private property. This is the site of St Dunstan's Villa, which was bombed in the Second World War, but survives as a few hummocks and some old trees. I suspect very little, possibly none of the early planting survives in the park. Most of the trees, I think, are more recent. Now, the east side of the park, where St Dunstan's Villa is the part that was opened first to the public. From the 1840s onwards, more and more of the park was open to the public, until by the 20th century, virtually the whole lot, apart from the private landscapes around the individual villas, was open to the public. And Repton wrote in Fragments, which was published in 1816, "For the honour of the country, let the parks and pleasure grounds of England be ever open, to cheer the hearts and delight the eyes of all who have taste to enjoy the beauties of nature." This is one of the drawings that was submitted to the Crown Estate from Nash's office, showing the layout of the two park villages, Park Village East and Park Village West. Park Village East was largely lost when the railway came through in the 1830s, 1840s, but Park Village West survives as a series of very pretty villas, well, large cottages, picturesque cottages, Gothic or classical, rather sort of more urban version of what was happening at Blaze Hamlet a few years earlier. Macclesfield Bridge over the canal, which didn't last very long, a barge loaded with gunpowder exploded under it. Well, gunpowder and petrol, as it happened. So it killed the crew of the boat, but it also took the bridge out. A later bridge with Lord Snowdon's aviary in the background, which I like to think there's a kind of a vague connection between this and the sort of menagerie that Repton was doing at, say, Woburn. The zoo. This, of course, has got nothing to do with Repton at all, but it is faintly evocative of his Chinese dairy at Woburn. Thomas Love Peacock wrote a satire on the picturesque controversy and had a character called Marmaduke Milestone, because Repton had unwisely suggested that landowners might like to mark the extent of their land plus by having their coats of arms on milestones. So this, of course, is George IV. Mr. Milestone was a picturesque landscape gardener of the first celebrity, who was not without hopes of persuading Squire Headlong to put his romantic pleasure grounds under a process of improvement. "My dear sir," said Mr. Milestone, "accord me your permission to wave the wand of enchantment over your grounds. The rocks shall be blown up, the trees shall be cut down, the wilderness and all its goats shall vanish like mist, pagodas and Chinese bridges, gravel walks, shrubs and shrubberies, bowling greens, canals and clumps of larch shall rise upon its ruins. It was reserved to the present time to invent the noble art of picturesque gardening." And that carries on. Modern villas well, not very modern villas, but recent villas in the same tradition by Quinlan Terry. Frieze Art Fair, which was on 2 weeks ago. And the Avenue Gardens, picking up on the more formal side of Repton, if you like. These were done by the Nesfields in the 1860s. One of the private estates, or not, well, now a public garden, but around one of the villas, St John's Lodge, statue of Hylas, who was drowned by naughty mermaids. And another of his tunnels, which leads to the tunnel in Russell Square. Russell Square was one of his kind of really urban interventions, done for the Dukes of Bedford when Bedford House was pulled down in about 1800 and the estate was developed. One of Nash's buildings in Bloomsbury Square on the left, the Society of Pharmacists. Duke of Bedford, a recent statue, or a recent photo with him with a suffragette banner around his shoulders for whatever reason. And the plan of Russell Square. Russell Square was built about 1800 by following an Act of Parliament. And the Reptonian theme carries on there. He complained that the land had already been flattened at great expense. He didn't have a lot of scope for landscaping, but he did plant it up with trees in this sort of formation. And the lime tunnel has been reinstated in the last 20 years. Fountains instead of the reposoir, which he built. And that's it, really. I could go on and say a lot about Nash and Repton, if I've said too much. Thank you very much.